and I think he is ahead. He had the momentum coming in. He had erased her entire convention bounce. I think right now Trump is dead even in the polls, and that means he's actually ahead.
Who won the debate last night?
ABC. It was a debate. I guess you would call it a sappy Harris versus a grouchy Trump, and then the blob, the ABC conglomerate. They had two moderators who fact-checked, I think, Trump 4 times, none with Harris, interrupted his tempo, asked embarrassing questions, which is okay, but they didn't do it too commiserately with Harris. Trump was thin-skinned. They tried to bait him. They called him a racist. They said he was a failure in business. They lied about that he wanted an abortion ban, that the police had been killed on 9/11, on January 6th, which she claimed was worse than 9/11, basically. And they were never, she was never fact-checked. So the only thing I can say about it is it won't be remembered in a week, I don't think. It'll be like the 2012 Romney-Obama, nobody of debate, the second one, no one remembers who won. They do remember that Candy Crawley destroyed her career and hijacked it and became a fact checker. So I think that David Muir and Miss Lindsay Davis will go down as really discrediting the profession. I don't think we'll see any more debates with mainstream media people involved. It's not even transparent. As far as the significance and the effect on the election, she exceeded expectations because she didn't melt down, and she was calm, kind of sappy. But the problem with that is it kind of confirmed the image that she has when she's evasive and she is disingenuous. She smiles and she's smooth and she chuckles and does that. And she did all these gesticulations during the exchanges while Trump was talking. In fact, it was supposed to be a hot mic prohibited debate, but apparently they let her speak or interrupt him a couple of times. So I think they looked at her temperament and they thought she was calm and collected, so to speak, but then she is when she's evasive. And the same thing holds true with Trump. We've known him for 9 years. We know he's thin-skinned, he's angry, he's blustering, and half the country believes that's part of the Trump mystique, that he's a bulldozer and he can't be anything else, but maybe you don't need anything else at this time. So I think that's pretty much where we are. It was a slight edge to her. As far as the issues, I was a little kid when Kennedy debated Nixon in 1960, and I watched it. And if you actually read the transcript afterwards, or you listened to him on radio, you all thought that Nixon won. But Kennedy was so much more collective, and he was clean-shaven. Nixon had a shadow and everything, that he won the visuals. And I think that's sort of a guide. If you looked at the debate and looked at Trump's scowl and his anger and going, arguing about crowd size, and she kept trying to bait him, and he went down these cul-de-sacs, she may have come out on top. At least the post-debate show that she had an edge. But if you listen to the sound bites that are already coming out, the zingers and sound bites, and if you were to listen on radio, I think he probably won, because he kept zeroing in on 3 important issues very quickly. One was, if she's such a candidate of change, why didn't she do anything when she was vice president for 3.5 years? And she's got almost 5 months left. So why doesn't she just enact it? And he said that. Why not just go and sign an executive order and have Biden do that, and you can get it? And the other point was, she's not telling us what she's going to do. She kept talking about her plan, I think, dozens of times, but she didn't spell out what it was. And then finally, she's trying to remake herself. She said she's woke. She said she's a radical. She said she wants to cancel patents, tax, all of that. And he didn't get in, unfortunately, to those details, but he did make the point that what she is now temporarily is not what she's been her entire life. So, but I think it's mostly will be known for discrediting the genre of having mainstream media moderators. participate. If they're going to have debates, they're going to have to get people from the podcasting world or radio or other venues, authors, or I don't know whom, but they're going to have to come from something other than this corrupt media fusion, DNC conglomerate.
How does it impact Trump's chances in November, and do you think he's set to win the presidency at this moment?
If you look at the poll, what the key indication is right now in America, what everybody is talking about is they look at the 2016 final result and they compare it with two things: where he was in mid-September and where he was on the day before the election. And they do that with 2016 and 2000. In 2020, it's just stark that he was anywhere from 5 to 6 to 8 points nationally behind. He was 15 behind in Wisconsin, and yet he lost that by less than a point. Generally, it's about they undervalued him by about 6 points in 2020. In 2016, about 3 to 4. So Trump right now, New York Times had him 2 points ahead in the national poll, but the Real Clear averages have him about a half a point behind. If the history is still valid, then he would be actually ahead, and I think he is ahead. He had the momentum coming in. He had erased her entire convention bounce. She probably stopped that Trump surge by not blowing it in a way that she had in all of her other appearances. So I think it's neck and neck, and that will depend on to what degree there's a foreign or national news item. If there's a break in the Israeli war or there's something bad abroad, it can affect the election either way. Or more importantly, the Democrats always have an October surprise. They had Russian collusion and Access Hollywood in 2016. 2020, it was Russian disinformation. The laptop was Russian fabricated. So I expect there'll be something in October. Whether it will be determinative, I don't know. But I think right now Trump is dead even in the polls, and that means he's actually ahead.
Just going back to the debate, it was interesting listening to the topics that they chose to talk about. There seemed to be many questions on January the 6th and Trump's comments around democracy and so on. You talked about the debate in 1969. To me, and to many people, I think, those questions and those topics aren't particularly relevant to American people's ordinary lives, to the major issues facing the country. Do you think this was just unserious, this debate?
Yeah, it is. I mean, she went back almost 40 years and talked about the rapist in Central Park, and then she mischaracterized it. While they may not have been guilty of rape in the appeal, but they were involved in probably in the assault, etc. So that was wrong. But they were trying to show that 30 or 5 years ago he had said something that she would call racist. Or they tried to say, I'm talking about the moderators, they asked Trump if he had identified her wrongly as not black. All of this had nothing to do with the real issues, and that is the American middle class can't afford prices that are 30% higher on staple goods than they were just 3.5 years ago. And abroad, the world is in flames, whether you look at, the major areas of transport, the Eastern Mediterranean, the Red Sea, the Strait of Hormuz, the Black Sea, the South China Sea, they're not navigable now. They're too dangerous for the world's ships. And we have hostile belligerents that no longer fear or respect the United States, and no one's taking up that slack. There's a war in Ukraine that could escalate into, as he said, nuclear war. Everybody discounts that, but it's possible. And then we have this Israeli deadlock that we have not allowed it to destroy Hamas, and it's going to have a reckoning with Hezbollah soon. Iran will be nuclear probably in a month or two, if rumors are correct. So those are the issues, and they didn't really. He tried to get on to those issues, but she was very successful in pushing his buttons, and one of the things he's sensitive about is his businesses. She said he was a failure, he inherited it, and then she said crowd size. So that, talking about how big the crowd is or accusing the crowd of leaving early because Trump was boring, those really get him off. And that means 5 to 6 minutes that we're not talking about these issues. And that was the design. Her strategy going in there was to smile, be sappy, be nice, fabricate a new identity. She's not the upper middle class entitled child of 2 PhDs, but she's from Berkeley. She's from Oakland, poor, discriminated against, a victim of racism. Mom was a small businesswoman rather than a PhD cancer researcher. That was one. The other was, do not spell out any particular policy position in any detail. Just say she was for small business or she's for border security, and then try to push Trump's buttons, and then outsource fact-checking, changing the tempo, the selection of questions to the moderators. And that all seemed to be what was on plan. I just think that she kind of showed us that she's a nice, kind of sappy person. And he showed us he's blunt and gets angry, and the moderators showed us that they're utterly corrupt. And out of that, I think we're back where we started before the debate.
Trump calls her Comrade Kamala. Is Kamala a communist, or is that Trump hyperbole?
I don't want to be evasive, but it depends on how you define communist. If you talk about Cold War totalitarianism, probably not. If you talk about soft communism or the increasing popularity of something that, like we see in Venezuela, which is authoritarian and communist or Marxist, probably so. And why do I say that? Because she has said she wants to cancel patents, she wants to confiscate guns, she wants to have a wealth tax that has never worked, she wants to tax unrealized income. She's promised all these giveaways, amnesty, transgendered surgeries for illegal immigrants, for prisoners, canceling illegally student loans by executive fiat. So yeah, she's a redistributionist in the Marxist mold. And Trump made a good point. Her father, who is on the same campus as I was, he's a retired economics professor. He's a very well-known post-colonial Marxist. And I think she is too.
The American media seems to be very biased in favor of Kamala, at least, the major broadcast networks other than Fox. You talk about ABC hosts, being biased in that debate. Has this always been the case that they've been so partisan, so extreme? It just seems quite shocking that, she's only done one media interview since announcing her candidacy, one major interview, I should say. Has it always been this partisan?
Well, since World War II, and the rise of television, I think it's a general rule that the media has been overwhelmingly liberal, but I didn't say left-wing. So Walter Cronkite or even Dan Rather, Peter Jennings, John Chancellor, they were to the left, but they grew up in the age of print journalism, and there were certain protocols. And the New York Times was left-wing or liberal, but it wasn't necessarily dishonest. And it wasn't complete. The Washington Post or the New York Times or ABC, CBS, NPR, they feel that their agenda of forced equality, which they call equity, is so important and so moral and so humane that any mechanisms to get there are justified by that end. And they started with George Bush in the Iraq War. They went out and called him a Nazi. That was really and on mainstream media they would print that. But they completely flipped out with Donald Trump, and I think part of it was cultural. They didn't like his accent, they didn't like his appearance, they didn't like his mannerisms, they didn't like his lack of political experience, they didn't like his bluntness, and they felt that they had a right, along with the administrative state, to destroy him. And that's what they've almost done. So I don't think we've seen anything quite like that in the distant past, but there is a reason why a national presidential Republican has not won 51% of the popular vote since 1988 and lost 7 out of the last 8 popular votes, and that's because they are dealing with a uniformly hostile and activist media, along with other institutions like Silicon Valley corporations, entertainment, K through 12 academia. But it's very difficult for a conservative in this country We've got to remember also immigration is such that we have 60 million people. It's an all-time high. It's an all-time percentage high at 16% of the resident population who were not born in the United States. I live in a state here in California. 27% of the people were not born in the United States, much less California. And the number of people on entitlements of some sort has soared in an exponential fashion. So a lot of this move to the left is reflected in the media is just simply that we've got huge constituencies now who come here from other countries on a non-meritocratic basis and they feel, and they are in dire need of educational, health, housing, food, subsidies to achieve what I think we assume will be instant parity. Anything less than that is racist. And so we have a huge constituency. And when you have 70% of the people voting, not on election day, with very little effort to ensure authenticity of a mail-in or early ballot, you can see that the dynamic does not favor traditional Republican conservative America.
Do you think that this demographic change, this demographic shift away from white people will be the fall of the Republican Party? They ultimately cannot win elections when immigration is just so high.
If they are, I think if they can control the border and if they can stop the 2.5 million people coming in from the most impoverished areas in the world, and if they can restore legal only 150,000 immigrants meritocratic, and then that infusion is halted, then the natural traditions of America will, by the second generation, we know, tend to make people conservative. For example, from 1890 to 1940, almost every Italian American was left-wing. If you say your name is Giuliani or Cuomo, nobody has any idea what your identification is. That is starting to begin. That was starting to really hasten, and it still is with where I live. If you're a male with the name Lopez over 40, we don't know what your political affiliation is. That's not true of women or young people who are inordinately left-wing. But the point I'm making is the infusion of immigrants then creates constituencies and feeds this democratic propaganda of race, oppression, disequilibrium, inequality. So that's essential to their message because most people do not believe in their agenda. They don't believe in an open border. They don't believe in these massive debts. They don't believe in disarming the military, transgenderism, critical race theory, defunding the police. None of these things have popular support. And for many immigrants, it's starting to show. The left says that Donald Trump is a racist, and even the McCain family and even the Romney himself and the Bushes tend to agree, but none of them can explain if that was so, why he got a higher black vote, and probably will this time, or a higher Latino vote than any of them did in the past. And that's because he's trying to substitute class for race and turn the Republican Party from an aristocratic stereotype, oligarchic stereotype, plutocratic, to a national sort of workers' party, upper middle class, middle, lower middle, and trying to say that the Democratic Party is the party now of the idle rich and the plutocracies on the coast. And that's hard to do given the efforts of the Democratic Party to hide what they're really about and the vehicles they have to get messages out compared to the Republicans.
You mentioned Bush and Cheney and so on, and Romney. You know, these are Republicans who have been very critical of Donald Trump. Dick Cheney recently said he's voting for Kamala Harris. Do you think that this is evidence of the so-called uni-party? What's going on here?
Yeah, I do. What happened to the Republican Party is, although they had, in theory, these traditional conservative agendas, in actual operation or fact, the people in that party who came to power or were in positions of authority were in the same cultural, social milieu as their opponents. And so they were tempted or bought off or leveraged. They got tired. In other words, Dick Cheney doesn't want his daughter outside completely of politics. Her whole life has been politics. His is. They don't want to be ostracized from the Republican Party. They are. They feel that in social terms or careerist terms or zip codes, they have more in common with their Democratic counterparts. Say a Dick Cheney and probably a Bill Clinton have more in common now than a Dick Cheney and somebody who's a steel worker in Ohio, or a guy at a Trump rally, even though they might both say they're conservative. So yeah, I think they feel the whole Never Trump movement is incoherent because Donald Trump represents 85% of all the positions that they've held. And they not only held, they raised money for, they pledged their careers for, they hectored people for, and suddenly all that vanishes and they say they're completely against him and therefore the agenda and have gone left. And I think more likely it's that particular elite is now always where they wanted to be. And I think they feel relieved and they're satisfied and they're kind of angry that they're orphaned politically, but culturally and socially they're where they always wanted to be.
It's interesting that Bill Clinton's rhetoric on, say, abortion or on immigration or crime in the 90s is not so far from Donald Trump's rhetoric today. Do you think that the 2000 election mattered? You're saying that Dick Cheney's endorsement of Kamala is evidence of the uni-party. Does it matter that Bush won? Would it have been what would have happened if Al Gore had won? Would that have been a major difference in US domestic and foreign policy?
That's a good question, because we don't know which Al Gore it was. At the time Al Gore ran with Bill Clinton, he was kind of a carbon copy. A lot of black figures at that time said they didn't like the idea of two Southern white candidates on the same ticket, and they were going to vote for him and hold their nose. Al Gore was considered sort of a conservative Democrat. When he had run in the primaries in the 90s, he ran to the right. And then later he lost his mind and became this radical climate change, kind of obnoxious. I think that change was predicated on him winning the popular vote, but losing the Electoral College destroyed him psychologically, and so he went hard left. But your point is well taken, given in what we saw from the Bush administration with No Child Left Behind, or expansion of Medicare, or the government, or open borders, or not the Jacksonian policy of punishing Iraq or our enemies that had maybe either been involved in 9/11 or had done other things warranting our attention, but this idea of utopian nation building and spending blood and treasure to turn traditional Islamic societies. And I don't know if the Democrats would have done that or not, simply because anytime they go overseas and they see there's a cost there, they stop because they want to spend the money at home. So I don't know, that's a good question. But there were a lot of appointments that the Bush administration made that and the earlier Bush administration. When you see the Supreme Court, put it this way, the Supreme Court would not have been liberal had not Republicans, going back to Eisenhower or Jerry, for all of them appointed liberal Supreme Court justices. Finally, Bush was under such pressure he had to withdraw a Harriet Miers and then substitute Alito, and that was really the first conservative person that he appointed that got confirmed. And Trump, of course, did 3 judges. So I think there's this idea that where Bush is now and where Romney is now and where Cheney is now is supposedly because of the uncouth nature of Donald Trump, but actually it's where they really wanted to be. They feel very comfortable with that very wealthy elite, Ivy League or well-credentialed class that is highly respected by the main venues. They like to be on public TV. They like to be treated well in the New York Times. They like a nice little compliment in NPR. They like to go to the same parties. They're on they like the corporate boards. They like the remuneration that comes from not being controversial or conservative. And it's considerable.
I want to talk about Tucker Carlson's recent interview with Darryl Cooper, a historian or sort of online historian. Do you think that Winston Churchill was the chief villain of the Second World War, as Mr. Cooper claimed?
Not at all, and I've written that. The great contribution of Churchill in World War II was threefold. Number one, he was a voice in the wilderness during the Stanley Baldwin prime ministership and Neville Chamberlain. In other words, he was arguing for the hurricane fighter. He was arguing for the updated supermarine. He was arguing to keep building up the fleet. That was really important. Number two, when the Germans invaded France, he had the unfortunate experience of being, the first day of his being prime minister was one of the worst days of World War II. And so for the first 3 weeks, it was nothing but bad news. France collapsed, and then there was, as you know, there was this panic in Britain because they looked, and what is now the EU and the NATO combined area was under the control either directly of Germany or allied with it, and Russia had kind of joined them under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and there was no sign the United States was going to enter, and here was Britain all alone. And people like Halifax and others said to him, Hitler wants to have a settlement. And this is what Mr. Cooper faulted Churchill for. But Churchill didn't say, this is crazy. He said, it won't work, but if some of you want to freelance unofficially and you want to go talk to Mussolini, go ahead. But you're not going to get anywhere. Because why would he want to negotiate when he has all of Europe and we're the only people left? And Churchill, there was some evidence he understood that Britain was actually in a pretty good position, and nobody but he really believed that, because he asked his admirals, he asked the RAF, Bomber Command, the Army, can Hitler invade Britain? And they all said no. He has no naval capacity to do so. He does not have air supremacy. Even the U-boats cannot completely shut off supply from North America. And what did he do? He put the British fleet in the Mediterranean. It destroyed the Italian fleet by the end of 1940 almost. He stopped the Italians in North Africa. He tried to blockade. He used Bomber Command and kind of what little resources he had there to at least have this semblance of fighting. And in that 13-month period before the invasion of Russia, he showed the world that the Axis, or what would become the Axis, were not going to be necessarily victorious. And that did two things, finally. It showed the Americans that if they came in, they had an ally that would never give up. And they would come in eventually, but I don't know if they would have under a Stanley Baldwin or Neville Chamberlain. And then number two, if they couldn't take Britain, then Hitler would inevitably turn eastward. And he said that. It seemed lunatic today, but he told his generals that one of the reasons they were going eastward and violating the Molotov-Ribbentrop, there were other reasons, but the primary reason was to force Britain to surrender or negotiate, because they would then have the entire world from the Atlantic all the way to the Pacific, and Britain couldn't withstand that. So he did that, Churchill, by sheer force of character. And a lot of the things that Mr. Cooper said about Churchill, I don't think are supportable by the record. I don't think he was ever bankrupt. I think he spent lavishly, and he had to write frantically to get out of debt, but he was never controlled by the media. There's a lot of people in the media that hated him as an opportunist. I think he drank, but can't recall more than one or two situations where contemporaries said that they had a meeting with him where he was drunk. So he said he was a drunk. I don't think that's accurate. The biggest thing I objected when his sort of attacking Britain for not making a deal with Hitler is there were 6 belligerents in World War II, major ones. Britain was the only one that went to war on the principle of territorial integrity, and they told everybody they would. They said if he goes into Poland after what he did in the Rhineland, what he did with the Anschluss, what he did with the Sudetenland, the betrayal at Munich, if he goes in there, and because he violated the Versailles Treaty, he said, I'm going to take Danzig and we're going to have a plebiscite about the Danzig corridor, which was going to be rigged because Hitler demanded certain conditions. But anyway, the point is, Britain said, if he goes in there, we'll go to war. Every other belligerent, the Soviet Union, the United States, Italy, Japan, either went to war because they were attacked or they attacked someone. And it was the only power to start the first day of the war on September 2nd, 3rd, in 1939, and go the whole 6 years to September 2nd, 1945, in both theaters. And he seems to be oblivious to that. And then finally, very quickly, and I'll shut up, he said things that were completely false. He said that the British waged a terror attack on the Black Forest, and it was the greatest terror in history. I mean, he has no idea of the 30 or 40 million people that were slaughtered by Tamerlane, Attila the Hun, and Genghis Khan collectively, or the Romans going into Carthage and killing 450,000 people when they leveled the city after a 3-year siege. But more importantly, that Operation Razzle was a desperate, half-baked idea to maybe start a fire in the Black Forest, and not because there were civilians living there. There were because it was still about a week left in the the fall of France campaign, basically, and there were arms depots because the Black Forest, as you know, is not that far from the French border, and that was the launching pad for the German army. They had all of their shells there, they had their depots, and the idea was we're going to incinerate this depot. And then to say that that was a proof of that he was a terrorist, and of course the people who started civilian bombing were not the British. It was the first day of the war when they bombed Warsaw, and they did it for 20 straight days. And then they turned right around and bombed the inner city of Rotterdam, 10 square miles. And the British still hadn't, they were still dropping leaflets at this time. And so they really didn't, they sent about 10 or 12 missions to Berlin, but it was over-occupied territory. It was so hard, they didn't do much damage. And it was only after the diversion of the German effort to knock out the airfields of Britain when they bombed London, and then they bombed Coventry, that they really in earnest tried to what they called area bomb. And they tried to area bomb because they tried to, as they would later tell the Americans in 42, you cannot go daylight bombing over occupied Europe. There's 20 airfields on the way to Germany and occupied France and Belgium. You cannot do it without fighter escort. We have no fighter escort. You cannot do it without sophisticated navigation. Do not try it. And we didn't listen to them. And they were absolutely right about it. And even in 39 and 40 and 41, if you look at the cumulative British bombing raids over Germany, at least until March of 42, they're almost minuscule. And yet he says this is a period of rampant terror. It didn't really start to the Hamburg raid of 42 firebombing.
So there's a lot to unpack there, and I've got a lot of questions about this, so forgive me. So we'll talk a bit about Mr. Cooper's other criticisms of Churchill first of all. I think there were 3 things that you missed out. There were more points he made, I'm sure. One, he said he was childish. I think fair enough, he was childish, but maybe you can talk about that. Second, he said that he was a warmonger, and that the reason that he wanted a war with Germany was to somehow correct his disaster in the First World War in Gallipoli, and he felt, this kind of urge to be some kind of hero to salvage his reputation from this terrible military campaign against the Ottoman Empire. And third, he said that the Second World War was such a disaster for Britain after the war. He looks at Britain today and he says, we lost our empire, we're flooded by millions of people who came from the Commonwealth, and we're sort of a multicultural country. We're a poor country compared to pre-Second World War. So just the disaster that happened to Britain, he blames on Churchill. So can you just comment on those other criticisms?
Well, let's start very quickly on the first one. I don't think someone who is childlike or childish over a person's life could write 27 books is what he did. Very serious books, many of them. I don't think he could have visited most of the world, and sometimes under very dangerous conditions. I don't think somebody who's childish, who's First Lord of the Admiralty, who's forced to step down, then volunteers to go into the trenches and stays there for 30. You can argue whether it was a hot zone or a mildly hot zone, but he was there for over 6 months in charge of a Scottish battalion, and he at least went out over the wire or under the wire into no man's land, somewhere between 30 and 40 patrols. Children don't do that. And so that's, I don't think that's, I mean, he was eccentric, but not childish. He also said, just before I go to the next one, that he hated Germans. Nothing could be farther from the truth. I mean, when Stalin said, maybe in a joke at the Tehran conference, that we're going to have to shoot 50 to 100,000 German officers, Churchill stormed out of the room. He was so furious. And his whole point was that he was in some ways admiring of German capabilities. And he said, the way to stop a war is to arm. And if you arm, they will respect us. If you don't, they won't. In World War I, just quickly, right before the war broke out in 1914, during the so-called dreadnought race, Churchill said, this is crazy that we're wasting this money and heading to our war with the German Navy. Why don't I go over to Germany and talk to Tirpitz, and maybe the two of us, no, and they thought that was crazy, but he had no hatred of the German people, as Cooper alleged. As far as Gallipoli, he just throws out the word Gallipoli, but he doesn't talk about what the situation was in 2015-16. The French and Germans, the French and British had already suffered in a year and a half 1 million casualties. And there was no way that anybody could break this deadline on the trenches. They hadn't developed tanks yet. Air power was not available. There was no such thing as airborne troops. The other theaters were static. The United States was not in the war yet, and we would eventually bring 2 million people in, but that hadn't happened. And so what Churchill was trying to do is use the Navy, which was unquestionably the world's largest fleet, to do something to the rear of the Central Powers in Germany. And the idea was that they could go into Gallipoli, sail up the Dardanelles, take Constantinople, and then knock Turkey out of the war, and then put pressure on Austria from the east, or at least blockade all of the areas that weren't under Allied control in the Mediterranean, and in the process guarantees Suez, etc. But when you look at the actual campaign, if you look at Hamilton, the ground commander, or the French and British naval, it was as much operationally unsound as maybe strategic. If they had a Montgomery, or if they had someone like Patton, it would have worked. If they had somebody like Haig, it would have worked. But they had very poor. Kitchener was not a good commander, and Hamilton was worse. And they took the areas that were assigned on the beaches, and they sat there, and they waited under extremely negative conditions. They waited for too long before they advanced. They didn't really understand that the channel had been mined. They had underestimated, because of the Balkan Wars, that the Ottomans were now pretty good soldiers because they were equipped with German weapons. They didn't understand that the collapsing Sultanate was leading not to incompetence and chaos, but to a new Turkish nationalism. So there were a lot of things that Churchill had no control over. But he took the blame for that, and he resigned. And so that, I'm not sure that that's quite accurate either. And then the third charge was that the British Empire fell. Well, the British Empire was going to fall anyway for a variety of reasons. And one was, if you look at the gross domestic product of Britain, and you look at its experiences in World War I or II, it went into World War II owing the equivalent of somewhere in modern dollars of about $1 trillion to the empire, whether that was Australia or Canada or India, and about $4 trillion to the United States. And the United States was not sympathetic. I think it was Coolidge said they rented the money, didn't they, as if they could pay it back when they couldn't. And they went in deeper into debt in World War II. And they had this world responsibility of governing the sea lanes, and they couldn't afford it anymore. They couldn't afford the fleet, they couldn't afford the army, and so their means and ends were very widely disparate. So, and then they had the United States, and they didn't have they had a sympathetic administration in helping it, interventionist Roosevelt, but not about the empire. In fact, at Yalta, if you look at the transcripts, FDR was very cruel to the British, and he said to Churchill, basically, Stalin doesn't like you, and Uncle Joe likes me better than you, so let me do the talking. And then he kept telling Churchill, the empire is through. Churchill was oddly, I don't know if Cooper appreciated that fully, he was considered odd man out in the Conservative Party at the time because he was adamant that he wanted to keep India and keep the empire and create a very gradual transition to the Commonwealth. So I don't think he can be blamed for that. I think what we're talking about is, to be frank, there is, I think in Britain and the United States, a truth, and that truth is a truth, and some of the people who support it make it the truth. And that requires changing the historical narrative contrary to data and fact. And the a truth is that there is now a uni-party, a bi-coastal elite that doesn't believe in nationalism, doesn't believe in patriotism, doesn't believe in the traditions of the West. It's kind of an oikophobic hatred, self-hatred, and that came up in the 20th century, part of the modernist movement that came out of World War I, partly the post-colonial, neo-imperial, all that stuff that came after World War II and was promulgated by the Cold War communists. And then the 60s Cultural Revolution. And out of that, what made the West strong, that was traditional families, Christianity, the Anglo-Saxon tradition, which, although it was racial in the sense of being white, it was the only real tradition that was ecumenical, because if you look at what British philosophers or even diplomats had said, and you look at the Declaration of Independence, the logical extension of that idealism was that you could become a Briton person if you accepted, or you could become an American citizen if you accepted the tenets, regardless of your national origins. And so, in any case, I can understand that criticism that Tucker shares and Cooper's, but the problem with that is then they use their anger and they focus it on World War II and said it all starts at World War II, and therefore all the pathologies that followed, the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, the Ukraine War, they're all extensions of this liberal post-war order that hates itself and doesn't represent the real people who created these great countries like America and Britain. And then, therefore, they're destroying their cultures. And we, as historians, can go back and find out its origins. And if that requires us to not be totally honest or honest at all, then it doesn't matter. And so what I'm getting at is, when I heard the name Darryl Cooper, I'm not a snob at all. I grew up on a farm, but I thought, oh my God, I wrote a 250,000-word history of World War II. I wrote 3 other books that had a lot to do with World War II, and I've never heard the guy's name. I thought, wow, you missed this critical article. Or I went immediately, that day it came out, 4 or 5 venues asked me to comment, and I said, I plead ignorance. I don't know his published, there was no published work. He wrote a book on Twitter, about Twitter, which is okay. We're in the arena, so you stand or fall by your ideas. But then when I looked at the transcript, both on his website and what he said to Tucker, and he was labeled the most popular, the most successful popular historian, and almost immediately I saw these factual errors just leap out. And so I kept asking myself, why is he doing this? He's not stupid. And the answer was, I think, in frustration at contemporary developments, he feels, as kind of a libertarian or paleoconservative, that he, with his expertise, can trace its genesis back to Churchill or World War II or something like that.
The ironic thing, I mean, I think there are many legitimate criticisms of Winston Churchill. You know, if you read Alan Brooke's diaries, he was a terrible war strategist. I think many British kind of nationalists in Britain would argue that he was too favourable to the United States. The Lend-Lease program sort of, completely destroyed us economically and so on. Maybe that was necessary. You could debate that. Also, again, some people blame him for losing the empire, but we've talked about that. But where do you think this is coming from the Conservative perspective? Why is Tucker and other people why are they trying to recast Churchill in this way? They say that the World War II is a myth and that we need to sort of break away from that moral story that we tell about ourselves.
Well, I think it's very similar to the mood in the United States in the 1920s and 30s. There was an anger at Britain, there was an anger at France, there was a large German community in the United States who felt that Germany had been mistreated. But most importantly, that had been billed as the war to end all wars. And the Versailles Treaty did not end that war for a variety of reasons. As Marshall Foch said, it guaranteed there would be another one in 20 years. So the Americans were very angry that all of that sacrifice, sending 2 million people cumulative over to Europe, ended up 20 years later. And so they blamed people for it. They blamed Wilson especially, and he was culpable in many ways. But the same thing then happened in World War II. They said, well, this time we're going to do it right. We're going to go over there and we're going to win, and there's not going to be any armistice. There's not going to be any armistice inside France, so the German army can come, who was beaten, exhausted, defeated, can go back home to a country that had never been invaded except for maybe the Rhineland, never occupied, and claim they'd been stabbed in the back, and then let hit. So we're going to go into, and that's what Churchill and Roosevelt said as early as 43. It's going to be an unconditional battle to the end, and we're going to go in there and we're going to occupy the country. And we're going to force our type of government down their throats. And we're not going to worry about, I think as Kamala Harris said, they sowed the wind and they're going to reap the whirlwind. So that was the idea. And then we came home, literally in Britain, and the next thing we knew, we had empowered Stalin. And it was a Cold War for 50 years. And then people started saying, well, my God, he killed 30 million people. He starved 20 million of his own. He was brutal. He was as bad as Hitler. And we supplied 25% of the wherewithal. And the old World War II logic, Hitler and Roosevelt, and by the way, Churchill and Roosevelt enunciated. And Hitler it was very clear that the Americans were much more naive than the British. Churchill was all over the map with aiding Russia, but he said if he was the devil, I would help him. And the point during the war was, we don't have the wherewithal to destroy the most effective army in history, the German army. They do. They do not because they're better than the Germans, not because they're better equipped, although they had a better tank and they had better artillery, and we supplied everything that they needed and could concentrate on what they did well in terms of industrial production. But they killed 3 out of 4, somewhere between 2 out of 3 or 3 out of 4 of all German soldiers. And the United States left that war, as did Britain, with a horrific tab, but it was 450,000 dead. Britain lost about 420,000. Japan lost almost 3 million, Germany lost 5 million, the Soviet Union lost 20 million, China lost 17 million, Italy lost over 1 million. And so my point is, by enlisting the Soviet Union to bleed the German army, it saved millions of lives. And I think in the process, and by the way, at this point, Churchill is out of office, Attlee's in, and Britain doesn't really have a voice in the alliance like it did because of the preponderance power of the United States in comparative terms. But the United States was very naive. This is the era of Alger Hiss, etc. And we really did believe that Uncle Joe wouldn't do this. And of course, there was no evidence that he wouldn't do it. He was a communist and a killer. So I think that anger at that then said the whole project, and this is the Pat Buchanan thesis of 2008 in his book, that this was a regurgitation of that argument. So I think that had a lot to do with the idea that World War II wasn't worth it. There was no difference, and Hitler, for his what I guess they feel are his excesses rather than his pathologies, was closer to the West than both, I guess, ethnically and politically than was Stalin. But boy, to make that argument, Daryl Cooper had to say things that were not just wrong, but pathetically wrong. That's what I thought was egregious. That to make that argument, yeah, I'm not invested. I mean, I'm an American and I admire the British, but I'm not here to say that Winston Churchill is the greatest person in the world. But when I look at the evidence, I think that he saved, in that critical 13 months, he saved the West. And I don't just mean Britain, I mean the United States too, and we owe him a debt of gratitude.
Well, I don't think he was the chief villain, but there are certainly criticisms, legitimate criticisms of the man.
I'd just like to say one thing, and
yeah.
One other thing I think should correct the record. He makes Chamberlain kind of the hero, and he says that Churchill and the historical record have demonized him. So it's Churchill versus. Nothing could be further from the truth. Churchill railed against Stanley Baldwin far more than he did Chamberlain, because Chamberlain finally listened to Churchill and started rearming in 38 and 39, 37. And then and he said that he was demonized, basically. He wasn't demonized he demonized himself. He came back from Munich. And unfortunately, he waved that piece of paper, Peace for Our Time. And if you look at what Churchill said at the time, he didn't hate him at all. He said he either basically believes that this is the end of territorial aggrandizement, or he feels maybe he was trying to rationalize. Maybe he thinks that he gave us a critical window of rearmament by postponing the inevitable. But whatever the reason was, when Chamberlain was out after the Norway disaster and Churchill was in, Churchill said it wasn't really Chamberlain's fault, and he invited him into the war cabinet. And he had very nice things to say about Chamberlain. He felt he was a tragic figure. He didn't feel that about Baldwin. So to say that there's this propaganda, this Churchillian propaganda that demonizes Chamberlain, it didn't come from Churchill. At least Churchill was very magnanimous to him and thought he was tragic rather than pernicious. And he was capable of saying terrible things about people. He said that it would have been better off for everybody if Stanley Baldwin had never been born.
Unfortunate for Stanley Baldwin. Some people argue that he did invest in the RAF and so on.
He did. Well, he came late to the party, but there were things about his prime ministership that were not all bad. That's absolutely correct.
We're getting very esoteric here. Thank you very much for
Davis
Hanson for joining us. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.